The wind bit at my face as I trudged along the frozen trail, my boots sinking into half-frozen mud. Wyoming was endless in its harshness, a stretch of wilderness that didn't care for anyone's grief, hunger, or broken heart. My name is Margaret Callahan, though it mattered little to anyone now. 3 weeks ago, my world had ended in a single deafening moment. The collapse of the Red Ridge mine that swallowed my husband, Samuel, and 2 others, leaving me with nothing but cold earth and an echo of his laughter. I'd returned to our cabin after the funeral, hoping for some comfort in the familiar walls Samuel had built with his hands. But his brother's letter lay on the table, stiff and cruel in its honesty. The cabin belongs to the Callahans. You have no claim here. Leave. Every sentence dripped with dismissal, as if my love for Samuel and the life we had built meant nothing. I packed my few possessions, his woolen coat, the letters he'd written me during the harsh winters, a small locket with his picture, and set out. I had nowhere to go. Bitter Creek, 2 miles behind me, had turned me away at every door. People, whispered as I passed, eyes avoiding mine, pity and judgment written across their faces. The sky overhead darkened, clouds thick and low, promising a snowstorm. My boots were thin, my coat barely a shield against the wind. Each step was a struggle. My fingers, red and numb, clutched my carpet bag as if letting go would mean vanishing entirely. I remembered Samuel's last smile, the warmth of his hand, and the sound of his voice calling me home after a long day at the mine. But now the world was silent except for the roar of wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. I tried to find shelter at a farmhouse, but the woman who answered the door shook her head and said, "A widow traveling alone? It wouldn't be proper." Proper. The word burned. What did propriety matter when hunger and cold threatened to kill me? I moved on, hoping to find a barn, a shed, anything. But the land offered nothing but empty fields and frozen earth. By late afternoon, exhaustion pulled at my legs. My boots were wet, my hands stiff, and I felt the first sting of panic. I could not stop. Not yet, not while the snow began to fall heavier, thick and wet, coating the ground in white. And then I saw it, a shadow in the storm. A cabin, small and sturdy, smoke curling from the chimney. Hope surged like fire through me, weak but alive. I stumbled toward it, praying the owner would be kind. The door opened, and a man stood there, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, calm as if the storm were nothing more than a whisper. He moved with quiet certainty, offering warmth, a blanket, something to eat. His name was Nathaniel Hayes, he said, and this was the Barrow Ranch. I had found sanctuary in the middle of nowhere, but even as relief washed over me, a tremor of unease lingered. I did not know him, and yet, for the first time in weeks, I could feel my heartbeat slow. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He only said, "You're alive, and that's what matters. Rest now." And for the first time since the mine collapse, I let my tears come, falling into the warmth of a stranger's fire, a stranger's home. I did not yet know the hardships that still waited outside, or the people who would scorn and threaten me. But for that night I could breathe, and it felt like life. I'll admit, I never thought I would survive the Wyoming winter alone. But there I was, alive, fed, warm. And yet, the weight of my husband's absence pressed heavier than the snow outside. And somewhere deep in that silent cabin, I began to wonder if survival could also mean something more. Hope. Morning came slow and gray. Frost etched delicate patterns on the window panes, and the wind outside was still relentless, rattling the logs and carrying a bitter chill that seeped into the bones. I woke beneath heavy blankets, the fire reduced to embers, yet the warmth of the cabin clung to me like a fragile shield against the world. Nathaniel was already up, moving with quiet efficiency around the room. He chopped wood, tended the stove, and brewed coffee with a precision that betrayed years of living off the land. He didn't speak much, but his presence filled the cabin, in a way that was steady and reassuring. I stayed in the corner, hesitant, clutching the small locket with Samuel's face. The past week's grief pressed on me, yet something in the rhythm of this man's work calmed the storm within. He noticed me finally, setting a steaming cup before me. The liquid was dark and bitter, but it felt like salvation. "Drink," he said simply. No questions, no judgments, just the bare acknowledgement that I existed and needed to survive. I wanted to speak, to offer thanks, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I nodded and sipped, letting the warmth trickle through me. The storm outside had not yet passed, and he had told me that venturing out was impossible. I realized then that I had nowhere else to go. No plan, no destination, only the rugged landscape and a stranger who had chosen to extend his hand when everyone else had turned away. After breakfast, Nathaniel guided me to a smaller, abandoned foreman's cabin near the edge of the property. Dust and cobwebs coated every surface, and the smell of stale wood made me flinch. "You'll make it livable," he said, handing me brooms and rags. "It's yours until spring. You'll have space, and you won't be in my way." His words, practical and almost stern, carried a weight I hadn't expected. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. This was more than shelter. It was a chance to reclaim a fragment of life, however small. The first hours were the hardest. I swept, scrubbed, and dusted, muscles aching from disuse and cold. Yet, as I worked, a strange sense of purpose began to grow. I could not bring Samuel back, could not undo the mine's collapse, but I could survive. I could carve out a place for myself in a world that had seemed determined to reject me, and somewhere in the back of my mind I sensed that Nathaniel's quiet vigilance would remain, a shield against the merciless Wyoming wilderness. As dusk settled, the storm outside softened to a persistent whisper, leaving the world muffled and white. I lit a small lantern, the flame trembling, casting shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I allowed myself a tentative smile. For the first time in weeks, the idea of tomorrow did not terrify me completely. Nathaniel returned then, offering a simple meal of stew and bread. I ate, each bite warming more than my stomach. It warmed my spirit. And yet beneath that fragile warmth a shadow lingered. The world beyond the ranch had been cruel, and I knew that safety here was temporary. People like me, widows alone in Wyoming, rarely found mercy. I would survive this winter, yes, but survival alone was not enough. Somehow I had to carve a place for myself, not just in the wilderness, but in a life that had been ripped apart. The first days on the ranch were a trial by ice and labor. Nathaniel taught me how to break ice on the troughs without spilling it, how to lift hay bales without straining my back, and how to feed the horses so that none went hungry. Each task left my hands raw, my muscles trembling, but with every chore completed, I felt a glimmer of purpose, tiny victories in a world that had tried to crush me. The wind was relentless, carrying frost that nipped at exposed skin and drifted through every crevice of the foreman's cabin. Yet inside, the fire Nathaniel built each morning crackled with a stubborn warmth, a reminder that not all battles had been lost. He watched me closely, rarely offering praise, but his gray eyes measured each effort with quiet approval. There was no sentimentality here, no indulgence, only the practical acknowledgement of survival. I remembered Samuel's hands, strong and capable, and a pang of grief stabbed my chest. But Nathaniel's steadiness reminded me that life could continue, even after unbearable loss. I cleaned, I swept, I scrubbed, and slowly the cabin began to feel like a place I could claim, not as a widow, not as someone defined by tragedy, but as a person who could endure. By the end of the first week, I had earned small privileges, a corner to store my few belongings, a stool by the fire, even a worn book Nathaniel allowed me to read while he worked outside. I discovered that he worked long hours alone, tending fences, mending harnesses, and checking the herd. He never asked for help unnecessarily, yet when he handed me a task, it was clear that he trusted me to do it well. I realized that this quiet trust was more valuable than words, more than any comfort anyone in Bitter Creek had offered. One morning, as I led a skittish mare across the frozen pasture, Nathaniel stood at the barn door, watching. His presence was solid, like the mountains, surrounding us, and for a moment I felt less like a trespasser in this harsh land. The mare's hooves slid across the ice and I caught her before she stumbled, gripping the reins until she calmed. Nathaniel nodded once, barely a movement, but the acknowledgement burned brighter than any praise I had received. It was enough to remind me that survival was not merely endurance, it was proving that I could belong somewhere. Yet beneath the labor and small triumphs, unease lingered. The town would not forget me easily. Bitter Creek's whispers had followed me this far, carried on the wind, and I knew that sooner or later someone would come to challenge the fragile peace Nathaniel and I had begun to build. Still, for now, I focused on the immediate. The herd, the ice, the fire, and the steady rhythm of work that kept grief from consuming me entirely. I would endure, and slowly I began to feel a flicker of something I thought lost forever. Hope. Winter's grip tightened, and with it came the creeping realization that the world beyond the ranch had not forgotten me. I had begun to find a rhythm, waking before dawn to help Nathaniel break ice and feed the herd, the cold a constant companion. I had learned to endure. But one evening, as the sun sank behind jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the snow, the sound of hooves echoed faintly over the frozen ground. My heart thudded in my chest. Visitors were rare, and rarely welcome in these parts, but I had learned that some arrivals carried more than news. They carried judgment, threat, or both. A group of men appeared over the ridge, faces hard and unfamiliar, but the moment I recognized the hat of Frank Coulter, the storekeeper from Bitter Creek, every muscle in my body tensed. He had been one of the first to cast judgment, to whisper about my reputation. And now he was here, accompanied by 3 others, laughing and shoving each other as if the frozen landscape were theirs to dominate. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from the dread pooling in my stomach. Nathaniel emerged behind me, calm and steady, as if his mere presence could shield the ranch from the approaching storm of cruelty. I realized then that survival alone was no longer enough. The cabin, the herd, even the small corner of the foreman's cabin I had claimed, all of it could be threatened by men who cared nothing for justice or mercy. My pulse quickened, but I refused to show fear. I had come too far, endured too much, to cower now. Nathaniel stood before me, rifle in hand, his eyes sharp and gray, measuring each movement of the intruders. The wind carried their jeers, mocking our solitude, and yet I felt a strange, stubborn defiance rising within me. They called out, voice dripping with scorn. Bitter Creek's whispers had crossed the valley. My heart clenched, but I stood my ground. This land, this cabin, this small fragment of life I had carved out, it was mine as much as it was Nathaniel's. And if they thought their arrogance could undo months of toil and endurance, they were sorely mistaken. The snow swirled around us like a living thing, and I knew that tonight survival would demand more than labor. It would demand courage, resilience, and a willingness to stand unflinching in the face of cruelty. Even as fear tingled in my fingers and toes, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. I was not helpless. Samuel was gone. Yes, but I had survived his absence. I had survived hunger, cold, and solitude. And now, in the shadow of men who sought to intimidate, I would survive once more. The Wyoming wilderness had taught me harsh lessons, but it had also shown me that I could endure, and this night the lesson would be tested to its fullest. The men advanced closer, their laughter cutting through the icy air like jagged knives. Frank Coulter's smirk was wide, his eyes gleaming with the cruel satisfaction of someone who believed he held power over others. My heart pounded in my chest, and yet for the first time since Samuel's death, fear wrestled with something stronger: defiance. I gripped the shotgun Nathaniel had left in the corner of the barn, my fingers tightening around the worn wood. I had never fired a gun in my life, but instinct surged through me, raw and unyielding. Nathaniel stepped forward, rifle poised, his stance calm but deadly. "Back off," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of authority that could not be ignored. The men chuckled, though the sound was more nervous than confident. They underestimated the quiet power of a man who had endured isolation, loss, and harsh winters alike. I could see it in Nathaniel's eyes, gray, unwavering, a warning that this land would not be taken lightly. I raised the shotgun, aiming above their heads. "Step away," I called, my voice steadier than I felt. My hands shook, but the determination in my tone seemed to unnerve them. For months, I had been powerless, cast aside by the world, but not tonight. Tonight, I refused to let their cruelty dictate my fate. The wind whipped through the valley carrying snowflakes that stung my cheeks, but it also carried my resolve. I would not cower. I would not be silenced. One of the men took a step forward, laughing nervously, and I pulled the trigger, firing. Into the air. The blast cracked like thunder, and for a heartbeat, silence fell. The horses stamped, snorting in alarm, and the snow swirled violently around us, masking our movements. The men faltered, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Nathaniel's presence beside me, solid and unwavering, reinforced a truth I had felt. Stirring inside for days, I was no longer alone. Coulter spat, his smirk faltering as he weighed the risk. "You won't get away with this," he warned, though the bravado was weaker now. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his rifle steady. "Get off my land. Now." The men hesitated, glancing at one another, and then, muttering curses under their breath, they turned their horses. Hooves thundered as they rode away, kicking up clouds of snow and leaving only the echo of their threat behind. As the valley fell silent again, I lowered the shotgun, my hands trembling but my heart steady. Nathaniel's eyes met mine, sharp and gray, and for the first time I felt seen. Not as a widow, not as someone fragile, but as a survivor. He didn't speak immediately, but his hand brushed briefly against mine, a silent acknowledgement. In that touch I felt something deeper than gratitude. A bond forged not through words but through the harsh trials of a winter that had tried to break us both. And I knew then that no matter what whispers or threats came from Bitter Creek, I would face them, not alone but beside him. The snow settled slowly over the valley, blanketing the world in white silence. The wind still whispered through the pines, but the threat from Bitter Creek had passed for now, leaving a quiet that felt almost sacred. Nathaniel and I returned to the barn, checking the horses and ensuring that nothing had been damaged during the standoff. My hands ached, my arms burned, but a fierce sense of accomplishment warmed me more than the fire ever could. I had faced men who sought to intimidate me, and I had not flinched. For the first time since Samuel's death, I felt the stirrings of pride rather than grief. Nathaniel watched me with quiet approval, his gray eyes softening as he handed me a fresh bucket of water. "You held your own," he said simply. I tried to brush off the praise, but the warmth of it seeped through my exhaustion. He didn't linger on words, didn't overpraise or coddle, just recognition, clear and steady. It was enough to remind me that survival wasn't just about enduring the elements or fending off cruelty. It was about proving, to myself and to the world, that I could reclaim agency in my life. That evening we returned to the main cabin. I helped prepare supper, slicing root vegetables and stirring the stew Nathaniel had begun earlier. The simple rhythm of cooking, cleaning, and tending to the fire created a quiet sense of home I hadn't felt in months. The cabin, once merely a shelter, began to feel like a place where I belonged, a space not defined by loss but by resilience. As we ate, the conversation was sparse but comfortable. The firelight danced across Nathaniel's face, highlighting the lines etched by years of labor and isolation, but also a gentleness I hadn't expected. Outside, the wind moaned against the logs, carrying the memory of the confrontation. I knew the people of Bitter Creek would talk, spreading gossip about the widow who lived alone with a man on a remote ranch. Yet, inside, surrounded by warmth, labor, and the quiet understanding of someone who had also endured loss, their whispers felt distant, powerless. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my life could move forward here, that the past could remain a memory without dictating my every step. As night fell, I tended the fire while Nathaniel read aloud from a small ledger, accounting for the herd and the winter supplies. I listened, catching glimpses of his life and the work that had sustained him long before I arrived. And somewhere in the steady crackle of wood and the soft scratching of his pen, I felt something fragile but real take root. Trust. Not blind. Trust. Not hope built on fantasy, but a quiet certainty that for the first time since the mine collapse I was not entirely alone. The winter weeks passed in a fragile rhythm, feeding the herd, tending the fire, repairing fences, and surviving the bitter cold. But the valley's silence was deceptive. One morning, as I stepped out of the foreman's cabin to fetch water, the distant sound of hooves reached my ears again, sharp against the snow. My chest tightened. Bitter Creek had not forgotten me, nor had the whispers that had followed me west. This time the intruders were closer, mounted and reckless, their shadows stretching long over the frozen earth. I could see them clearly now. Rough men, faces set in cruel amusement, their eyes scanning for weakness. I ran back to the main cabin, breath clouding in the frigid air, and found Nathaniel already alert, rifle in hand. His calm steadiness grounded me, but I felt the tremor of fear stir anyway. I gripped the shotgun, the wood solid and familiar beneath my fingers, and took a deep breath. "We've faced them before," Nathaniel said quietly, but I could sense the tension under his control. The truth was undeniable. We were outnumbered, and the men were brazen this time. Yet I felt no hesitation, only the fierce, stubborn defiance that had carried me through the storm that first brought me here. They rode into the yard, shouting, attempting to provoke, but Nathaniel and I held our ground. I saw Frank Coulter at the front, sneering as if he could intimidate me with nothing more than words and presence. I remembered the icy trail, the nights alone, the relentless wind, and my hands did not shake. I raised the shotgun, feeling its weight, feeling my own resolve, and fired a warning shot into the snow. The thunderous crack echoed across the valley, startling the men, the horses stamping and whinnying in panic. Nathaniel's rifle followed swiftly, aimed not to harm, but to reinforce the boundary we would not allow crossed. For a heartbeat, time froze. Snow swirled around us, white and blinding, the wind howling like a predator circling. And then the men faltered. The odds, the cold, the unexpected resistance. They were unprepared for a widow who would not yield and a man who would not retreat. Slowly, reluctantly, they turned their horses and galloped away, muttering threats that could not shake the fortress of fire and determination we had built here. I lowered the shotgun, my hands trembling, but my heart soared with a newfound certainty. I was no longer the helpless woman Bitter Creek had dismissed. I was part of this land, part of this life, and part of Nathaniel's world. And he, quiet, steady, ever watchful, had silently acknowledged it. This was no longer about survival. Alone, it was about standing, fully against a world determined to keep me small. For the first time since Samuel's death, I believed that life could be reclaimed, carved brick by brick, through courage, defiance, and the strength I had discovered in the most unforgiving of winters. Spring crept slowly into the valley, carrying with it the first warmth since the brutal winter had begun. Snow melted into running streams, and the frozen fields began to hum with life again. I worked alongside Nathaniel each day, learning to tend the cattle, mend fences, and ride across the rugged landscape with a confidence I had never imagined possible. The foreman's cabin, once a place of mere survival, became a home in its own right. I arranged my few belongings, hung fresh linens to dry in the sun, and even found the courage to plant a small patch of vegetables near the porch. It felt like planting hope itself in the thawing earth. The work was relentless, and yet in its rhythm I found solace. Nathaniel and I moved with a silent understanding, side by side without unnecessary words. He allowed me to prove my worth, never coddling or belittling, only guiding when necessary. Slowly, the quiet trust between us solidified into something deeper, though neither of us spoke its name. Even in the stillness of dawn, as the horses stirred and the cattle lowed, I felt the first glimmers of belonging in months, perhaps years. Yet the world beyond the valley had not forgotten me. A traveler, passing near the property, shouted warnings, carrying gossip back to Bitter Creek, and I knew that the whispers would continue. Some mornings I would catch Nathaniel's gray eyes scanning the horizon, a silent acknowledgement that threats, subtle or otherwise, could return at any time. And still, I refused to shrink. The widow they had dismissed as fragile was gone. In her place stood someone who could weather storms, wield a shotgun, and hold her ground in the snow. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence with Nathaniel, I realized how far I had come. My arms ached, my hands were blistered, but I felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with praise or recognition. I was alive. I was capable, and I had carved a space for myself in a world that had tried to erase me. Nathaniel nodded once as he passed me a hammer, and I knew the acknowledgement carried weight heavier than words. This land, these animals, and the man who had rescued me, together they formed a life I could protect, nurture, and finally call my own. The valley stretched beyond us, wide and unforgiving, yet it no longer felt lonely. The past lingered, yes, but it no longer defined me. Survival had become more than enduring. It had become living, and with every swing of the hammer, every feed given, every dawn witnessed, I felt the fragile tendrils of hope entwine with the strength I had found in the harshest winter of my life. Summer's heat baked the valley, but with warmth came new dangers. One morning, smoke curled over the distant hills. Rival ranchers, seeking to claim territory Nathaniel had long defended alone. I felt a chill despite the sun. We rode toward the threat, the herd restless behind us. Nathaniel's hand brushed mine as we rode side by side, a silent reassurance. The men were bold, armed, and cruel, expecting to intimidate. But together we faced them, steady and resolute. My heart raced, yet I no longer felt powerless. Each word Nathaniel spoke, each gesture of mine, was defiance against the world that had tried to keep us small. The standoff crackled with tension, a test not just of skill but of courage, trust, and the bond forged through months of harsh winters, long days, and nights of quiet understanding. The rival men pressed closer, their eyes full of greed and arrogance, but I felt something I hadn't in months: fire. Nathaniel's rifle was steady, but I raised the shotgun, no longer trembling, and aimed with determination. The first warning shot cracked through the air, sharp and unforgiving. Horses stamped, and the men faltered. I met Nathaniel's gaze. In that look, we understood one another completely. Together we were unyielding. Each action, each word built a wall of defiance the intruders could not breach. Finally, realizing their intimidation had failed, they turned and fled, leaving smoke and threats behind. We stood in the valley, wind whipping snow from the shaded peaks, but nothing could touch the fortress we had built. Our courage, our trust, and the home we had carved from wilderness. The valley lay quiet at last, the threat of outsiders gone like smoke in the wind. Nathaniel and I stood together on the porch, watching the herd graze under the warming sun. For the first time in months, the weight of grief lifted slightly, replaced by a fragile, steady hope. The foreman's cabin felt like home. The main house warm with life, and the land itself seemed to breathe with renewal. I realized that survival had led to something greater: belonging, trust, and even love. Nathaniel's hand found mine, fingers intertwining, and I no longer felt alone. Bitter Creek's whispers could fade into nothing. Here, in the Wyoming wilderness, we had built a life on courage, resilience, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. That afternoon, as we worked together to repair a fence, laughter slipping between us, I understood fully. The storms had passed, and we had weathered them. Together.